Chapter 7, Breakdown Part 2. So, what do you think? Luce looked at Amity expectantly after she'd taken her to the bathroom so she could look into the large mirror to inspect her altered appearance. Amity spent a moment just staring at herself, then first reached for the mirror to touch the illusion ears of the reflection, and then touch the ears themselves. This is super weird. I don't think I'm ever getting used to that. Me neither, honestly. It did look strange. Luce missed the cute pointy ears, although there was probably no way Amity would not ever be beau to her. But I did a solid job at making you look more human, and you still look just as pretty as you usually do. Luce was too distracted to notice Amity's slight blush. Oh! I need teachers to Gus when we get back to the bowling aisles. He'll be so excited! A couple weeks of not going back were okay for Luce. She could handle that. She expected it to be at least that long after all. Probably longer depending on how much homework they'd be given over the different breaks and depending on whether or not her mom had something planned. And they had a way to stay in contact with everyone, which was more than she expected. She needed to bring a bowling aisles mirror back to her room the next time she went. Maybe when she brought Amity home. The whole situation was less than ideal, and she could tell that Amity was still really shaken by the fact that she wasn't able to go home sooner. But Luce would do her best to keep her distracted. Oh yeah, you're right. He definitely will be, Amity smiled at her. You know, it's pretty amazing that you were able to figure all this out in just a couple hours. Luce blushed a little, rubbing the back of her neck sheepishly. I've been playing around with changing glyphs for different results all summer. I guess I'm just getting kind of good at it. More like amazing. Don't sell yourself short like that. Ah, shucks. You're way too sweet. Was Amity just being nice by making her all these compliments? Luce was almost starting to think she might be flirting with her. She shook her head. What a ridiculous thought. Just being honest. Amity cleared her throat and quickly changed the topic now that she was getting all flustered again. How soon is your mom going to be home? Luce took a look at her phone to check the time. Soon enough that I should really start cooking. Do you want to go over what we'll do one last time before I do? Amity shook her head. Thanks, but I think I'll manage. It wasn't like the plan itself was very complicated. Whether or not they'd manage to pull this off was a different story, though. While Luce went downstairs, Amity went back to her room and called her siblings again. Luce and Amity had kept them updated about what exactly the plan was after deciding that Camila witnessing part of the call would probably make their story more believable, and asked them to make sure they were alone when Amity called again in order to avoid background noise. Thankfully, Luce had been right. Amity's not phone worked just fine. You guys ready? She asked when her sister up. Emra nodded. We went over what we're going to say a couple of times, so we're probably less than ready than overprepared. Amity's brother raised an eyebrow at her. But are you sure you're ready, Mins? What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged. I mean, it's a decent plan. You're not very good at acting, though. We both know you can't cry on command. Yeah, you're right. Amity sighed. She thought it over, and while she didn't like the solution she'd come up with, it looked like she had no other choice. But you guys know me very well, don't you? You know what I'm afraid of and what hurts me. Her siblings looked at her in surprise, and it was obviously dawning on them what she was asking of them. Are you going where I think you're going with this? Because in that case, Titan, no! I'm not doing that! Edric crossed his arms and shook his head. My sibling powers are for teasing, mean-spirit teasing at most. Not for making my little sister cry. Andy sighed and looked at her older sister with pleading eyes. Emra? Please? Emra gulped. Mins, are you sure you want me to? There were no words to express just how much she did not want to do this right now. But Amity nodded vigorously. They had to pull this off. If they couldn't, Amity didn't even want to think about what that would mean for her. Weeks of sleeping in the abandoned cabin in the woods, most likely. The thought wasn't especially thrilling. She shuddered. We need this to be as believable as possible. If Camila doesn't buy it, I'm screwed. I want you to do your worst. Make me cry. I mean it. She sounded very determined. Emma clenched her fist to keep her hands from shaking, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. Edric had a point. But if Amity needed their help and this was all they were currently able to do to help her, she'd do it. What she wanted or didn't want to do didn't matter in that case. Okay. Another deep breath. And Amity? I'm sorry. It only took a couple of sentences out of her sister's mouth to shatter Amity's heart into a million pieces. Thanks to the small spell circle Emerald had drawn into the air in front of her, it wasn't her own voice that came out of her mouth when she started speaking, and when Amity looked up, it wasn't her sister's face that she saw. Her mouth went dry. I expected more from you, but I guess that was my mistake. These words in combination with that voice, it was just too much. Your parents warned me that you were their least talented child. That you're still using a training wand at your age is embarrassing. But I still thought maybe you could be shaped into something special despite that. Well, it looks like I was wrong. That it wasn't real ceased to matter. Each word was like a knife precisely aimed at her insecurities. She felt like someone had punched holes through her lungs, taking away her ability to breathe. Lilith, You're a failure, Amity. By far the worst student I've ever had. It was naive of me to ever think otherwise. And now you're going to skip school, aren't you? You'll lose your badge. Your parents are going to be so disappointed in you. All color drained from Amity's face. She hadn't even thought about the fact that she was going to miss school because of this whole issue. But now that was all she could think about. She was going to have so many absent days. She'd miss so many lessons that she wouldn't be able to ever catch up. She'd have to repeat the year, and then that would go on her report, and everyone would know how much of a failure she was. The Emperor's Coven didn't just let anyone join. There was no way they'd choose someone that had repeated a year over someone who hadn't, no matter what the reason for the repeat was. Her parents. Her parents would be livid. And as Emma kept on talking with a voice that wasn't hers, Amity spiraled. To hear all those things from someone she looked up to, someone she'd wanted to be like and maybe one day even work with. It was too much. The voices in her head grew louder and louder. Lilith mixing with those of her parents and teachers and eventually those of her friends and even Luce, all shouting at her that she was a failure, a disappointment, and that nothing she did would ever be good enough. Just like that, she lost everything she'd ever worked towards. Mom, you're back! Luce yelled when she heard the front door close. Hopefully, Amity had heard that and got started with her part. Camila shook her head and chuckled when she walked into the kitchen. Mia, I'm not deaf. You don't have to be so loud. Sorry, I wasn't sure how well you'd hear me over the boiling water. Luce smiled at her innocently, gesturing towards the water boiler. I made soup for lunch. I hope that's okay. Camila smiled at her daughter in delight and rumpled Luce's hair. Of course, it smells wonderful. They'd been doing it this way for a while. When Camila was home first, she cooked. When her daughter was, Luce cooked. Luce liked to think she was a decent enough cook. Not perfect, but good enough to serve her food to guests without feeling bad about it. Her mom had taught her all the important stuff when she'd asked her to, and Luce had picked up the rest from a cooking class at school and the internet. Can you get Amity? She's upstairs trying to reach our parents. Camila crossed her arms. She still hasn't reached them? Luce shook her head. They're not very reliable, are they? That their daughter should have been home the day before, and they hadn't even bothered finding out where she was when she hadn't shown up at home was ridiculous. Camila hadn't even met these people, and she already didn't think very highly of them. Luce sighed. You can say that again. Amity sometimes spent hours on her phone trying to reach them back at camp, but to no avail. They're always very busy with work. Camila shook her head in disbelief. It wasn't that she didn't understand working much and not being able to spend an endless amount of time with one's daughter, which was something she deeply regretted and wasn't able to change. But this was on a whole different level. Had Luce not returned when she was supposed to, Camila would have called her immediately. And if she hadn't been able to reach her, she would have driven back to camp herself and turned the whole place upside down in order to find her. Of course, I'll go get her so she can eat with us. When Camila walked up the stairs, it didn't take long for her to realize that something was off. She could hear voices coming from her daughter's room, one of male and two female. And the ones that weren't Amity sounded furious, while Amity herself sounded completely broken. Mom, Dad, Amity's voice cracked. Don't you dare call us that! The male voice shouted. Camila winced at the harshness of the words and the tone. She hadn't meant to listen in on the phone call. But the shouting was hard to overhear, and now she was starting to get worried. Whatever this was about, it didn't sound good. Apparently, Amity had finally reached her parents, but Camila was starting to feel like it might have been better if she hadn't. You're a disgrace to the family name, the female voice continued, sounding just as harsh as the male one. You should be ashamed of yourself. I refuse to consider a useless, worthless disappointment like you, my daughter. There was a pause, the only thing Camila could still hear being Amity's broken sobs. It was the male voice that finally broke the silence. Don't you dare show your face at our doorstep ever again! Then the room went quiet again, and this time it remained that way. A few seconds later, Amity glanced up to notice Camila standing in the doorframe, glancing at her with a sympathetic look on her face. Oh, hi, Miss Nocita. She couldn't even manage a half smile as she looked up at Luz's mom, wiping tears from her eyes, her voice shaking almost as much as her body was. Camila gave her an apologetic look. She forced herself not to show how angry she was at the people that had just said all these things to Amity. Unforgivable things that no one, no matter the circumstances, should have said to their own child. Anger wouldn't help Amity right now. She needs sympathy more than anything. I really didn't mean to listen to your phone call. It's just... So their plan had worked at least. Amity felt too sick to be relieved. I know, it's not your fault. They get very loud when they're mad at me. Amity started sobbing even harder. She expected a bad blow. She expected this to hurt. But not like this. If there's anything I could do for you, anything at all, just say the word, okay? Camila refrained from asking what this had been about. Amity needs support right now. Not someone that forced her to explain in depth what had caused her parents to say all these things to her. She shouldn't be thinking about them at all. She deserves so much better. Could you please go get Luz? Amity didn't care about anything anymore. Not about their plan. Not about whether or not she'd have to sleep in that stupid cabin in the woods. Right now, all she wanted was for Luz to hold her before she fell apart completely. Of course. After her mom had come to get her, Luz rushed into her room as fast as she could. She didn't know what exactly it was, but something about the way Camila had told her that something had happened and Amity needed her. Something about the look in her eyes when she said it had made Luz's blood run cold. If her mom believed their lie this much, she had a really bad feeling about this. Luz pushed the door to her room open. It took one look at her friend for Luz to know that Amity wasn't faking anything. She was shaking and crying and looked downright sick, her face completely ashen. Oh my God, what happened? Luz sat down on the bed next to her and pulled her friend into a tight hug. I'm right here. Whatever it is, it's going to be okay. Amity just sobbed into Luz's chest and shook her head as she clung to her. No, Luz, it won't be. Nothing's going to be okay. She still couldn't stop shaking. Even her hands desperately clinging to Luz's back wasn't helping her calm down. Luz felt her heart shatter, and for a few seconds, she forgot how to breathe. Seeing Amity so broken was too much for her. This wasn't like the way Amity had cried the day before. Her breaking down the way she had then had been scary enough. But this... Luz had never seen her this upset before. She could feel Amity crumble to pieces in her arms. What could the twins have said to her that had hurt her this badly? What happened? Luz's voice was soft and sweet and full of worry. But Amity couldn't bring herself to force out even a single word. She just sobbed even harder, burying her head deeper in Luz's chest. Can I? Camila asked softly. Amity nodded. The less she had to speak right now, the better. Even though she wasn't really upset for the reason her friend's mother thought she was. She just wanted to get this stupid act over with so she could curl up into a ball and cry herself to sleep. Her parents kicked her out. Amity, I'm so sorry. Luz hugged her friend even tighter, eventually shook up at her mother with maybe the most desperate look on her face Camila had ever seen on her daughter. Camila already knew what her daughter was about to ask before she even opened her mouth. Mommy, can she stay here, please? Just for a while? Luz, we can't just... It wasn't that Camila didn't want to help Amity, but things weren't that easy. It's okay, Luz. I'll figure something else out. I don't want to be a burden to you guys. That was too much. The soft, shaking voice, along with everything she just overheard, was all that was required for Camila to immediately change her mind. Amity, you're not a burden. It's okay, you can stay for now. Nobody deserved to be treated this way by their parents. And with how much Amity meant to Luz, even if Camila hadn't been the kind, caring woman she was, she would have let her stay. Because if she hadn't, the damage not helping Amity out right now would have caused her relationship with her daughter wasn't worth the risk. They'd have to find a different solution eventually. But at least for a bit, Amity could stay with them. There's going to be a bunch of legal issues we'll have to take care of if you stay here temporarily, especially since your papers are missing. But we'll figure it out. Really? Luz hugged her mom, relief washing over her. As bad as this whole situation was, as much as her heart hurt at seeing Amity cry and not knowing why and not being able to help, at least it had worked. Amity would get to stay with them, and she didn't have to hide her in the attic or something. Now, she could put most of her focus for the next couple of weeks into making her friend feel better about whatever it was her siblings had told her. You're the best. Amity looked up at Camila, her teary eyes full of gratitude. I'm not going to cause you even the slightest bit of trouble, Miss Noceda. I promise. Camila smiled and shook her head. That's sweet, but I won't hold you to that. Mistakes are human. Luz had caused her mother plenty of trouble in the past, but that didn't mean anything she'd done wrong had ever made Camila love her less, or that anything she would still do wrong in the future ever could. Luz, I'm going to go downstairs to make a few phone calls, okay? I'm going to enroll Amity at your school. I refuse to let this take away her future. These words hurt Amity more than they helped her, both because the reality of the situation was that there was nothing Camila could do about her messed up future, and because the kindness and lack of judgment in her voice made Amity question how it was possible that it felt like this woman she barely knew cared about her more than her own parents ever had. Amity spent the next few hours on the bed, unable to pick herself up off the mattress, and she rarely ever stopped crying. Luz didn't leave her side, not even for a single minute. She just sat there with her in silence for a long time, squeezing Amity's hand to remind her she wasn't alone with this and always making sure she was as comfortable as possible. Eventually, Amity managed to repeat what her sister had said through her sobs. Luz just held her and listened while she did, and despite Amity telling her that she asked Emra to make her cry, Luz couldn't help but get angry. Emra had known exactly how much this would hurt Amity, and still said all those things to her in the absolute worst way possible. You know your parents won't really stop loving you just because you get a couple bad grades, right? Luz said reassuringly after her friend had finished telling her about what had happened. Amity started sobbing even harder. Believe me, Luz, they will! Luz's blood ran cold. Amity's voice was shaking so badly. She sounded so upset, so broken, but at the same time so incredibly certain that it made Luz feel sick. You're not serious, she mumbled in disbelief. It scared Luz how sure she was that Amity was actually indeed serious from the way she'd spoken. Amity buried her head in Luz's chest, trembling like a leaf. They're going to hate me, Luz. They're going to actually throw me out. Her voice was barely above a broken whisper. Luz wasn't a violent person by any means, but right now, the pure terror in Amity's voice made her angry beyond words, and she was about ready to punch Amity's parents through a wall as soon as she had the opportunity to do so. What had they done to their daughter that made her so scared of them? What had to be wrong with a person to care more about their child's grades than her well-being? The more Luz heard about Amity's parents, the more determined she became about making sure that Amity never had to go back to Blight Manor. Well, forget them then. Amity, you're incredible. If they don't see that, that's their mistake, not yours. You have so many things you should be proud of, way more than some grades or a top student badge. You're smart and brave and beautiful, and you have a kind heart, despite being raised by people that so obviously don't share that quality. You're ready to face your fears and grow past your mistakes for the people you love. That's stronger, braver than most people are. And you're funny and supportive and just in general, the greatest person I've ever had the honor to meet, let alone be friends with. Seeing you is all I need to brighten my day. I've never met anyone like you, Amity. Don't let your stupid, blind, horrible parents define what makes you special. You're special because you're you. That's all you ever need to be. Amity lifted her head a little and pulled Luce even closer. She was still too shaken up to manage even a small smile. But Titan, she wasn't even sure how it was possible to love someone as much as she loved Luce right now. Luce, thank you for everything. Luce hugged her back gently, still careful not to touch the area of the injury. Anytime. And then they went back to sitting in silence, Amity's heart still heavy, but she was able to breathe a little easier now. Sometime later, Camila came in to bring them some heated up soup. I thought you might be hungry. Luce looked up and smiled weakly at her. Thanks, Mom. She took the tray and placed it down on the bedside table. Amity didn't lift her head, but she did make a noise of silent complaint when Luce let go of her. I don't think we'll be coming back downstairs today. Camila gave her a sympathetic smile, glancing at the incredibly upset Amity as she banished the memory of herself and her own inconsolable daughter in this very same room so many years ago to the back of her mind. That's okay. Amity can take all the time she needs. If there's anything I can do for you. Actually, Luce bit her lip. She felt guilty even asking what she was about to, but she didn't really have much of a choice. She had to somehow be functional enough to go back to school the next day after all. I really need to take a shower, but I don't want to leave Amity alone in my room. Can you stay with her for a couple of minutes? I'll be quick, I promise. I'll eat afterwards. Camila hesitated. Would you be alright with that, Amity? She didn't want to do anything that their visitor, or, well, not quite visitor anymore, wasn't comfortable with. She could imagine that crying in front of someone that was basically still a stranger to her was about the last thing she wanted to do right now. After a moment of hesitation, Amity nodded. Okay, in that case, I'll stay. When Luce had left the room, Camila pulled her daughter's desk chair up to the bed in order to not invade Amity's personal space too much. Is this okay? Amity lifted her head off the pillow to face Luce's mom and muttered a soft thank you. The warmth and kindness in Camila's eyes were the same Amity always saw in Luce's. When Luce came back into her room about 10 minutes later, hair dried and dressed in her pajamas, Amity had reached for Camila's hand and Camila was humming the same song she'd always sung to Luce when her daughter had been upset when she was little. There was a strange peacefulness to the scene, and for a moment, Luce didn't dare interrupt it. Amity didn't have parents that behaved like ones back home. Maybe what she needed most right now was a parent that did, even if it wasn't her own. End of Chapter 7.